They stood on the bridge wings of the heavy cruiser Tone, 8,000 tons of steel and firepower cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942. The crew could feel the vibration of the ship's engines through the deck plates, that steady thrumming pulse that told experienced sailors their vessel was at battle readiness. Forward and aft, the cruiser's 4 twin turrets housed 8-inch guns, each barrel capable of hurling a 260-pound shell over 18 miles. These were not defensive weapons. These were ship killers, designed to penetrate armor and destroy enemy vessels in the kind of decisive surface engagement the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for, had dreamed of, had built its entire doctrine around for nearly 4 decades. Captain Tamotsu Takama had commanded Tone for 2 years. He knew every detail of his ship, from the steam pressure in the boilers to the precise rate of fire his gun crews could maintain in sustained combat. His ship and 7 other heavy cruisers were positioned as the striking force of the Midway operation, ready to deliver the knockout blow once the American fleet was located and engaged. The plan was clear, had been briefed repeatedly in the days leading up to the operation. The carriers would launch their strikes against Midway Island itself, suppressing the American air base there. American carriers, if they were present, would reveal themselves when they counterattacked, and then the heavy cruisers would close for the decisive surface action that would destroy what remained of American naval power in the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was the battle the Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared for since 1905. Since Admiral Togo had crossed the T at Tsushima Strait and annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet with concentrated gunfire. That victory, achieved through superior positioning and gunnery, had become the foundational doctrine of Japanese naval warfare. The decisive battle, the Kantai-Kessen, would be won by battleships and cruisers closing to gun range and pounding the enemy into submission through superior firepower and superior will. Every Japanese naval officer had studied Tsushima. Every gunnery drill, every tactical exercise, every war game at the Naval War College in Tokyo had refined this doctrine. The 8 heavy cruisers at Midway represented the pinnacle of this thinking. Tone and her sister ship Chikuma were reconnaissance cruisers, designed to launch float planes that would find the enemy and report their position. Mogami, Mikuma, Kumano, and Suzuya formed one cruiser division, veterans of the invasion campaigns in the Dutch East Indies and the Indian Ocean. Haguro and Myoko formed another, powerful vessels that had covered the invasions of Malaya and the Philippines. Together, these 8 ships mounted 64 8-inch guns. Their armor could resist 6-inch shells at combat ranges. Their crews were combat veterans, confident in their training and their equipment. What Captain Takama and his fellow cruiser commanders did not yet understand, could not yet comprehend, as they steamed toward their battle stations northwest of Midway Island, was that they were about to witness the death of everything they believed about naval warfare. The guns they trusted, the doctrine they had perfected, the entire philosophy of surface combat that had defined their navy for generations was about to become irrelevant in a span of 6 minutes. Not defeated, not overcome through superior enemy tactics, simply rendered obsolete by a form of warfare their doctrine had failed to fully account for. The irony would be devastating. They had brought overwhelming surface firepower to a battle that would be decided entirely by aircraft they could not reach and could not defend against. Their 8-inch guns, capable of destroying any ship afloat in a surface engagement, would fire not a single shot at an enemy vessel. Instead, they would watch, helpless, as 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burned and sank, taking with them not just ships and men, but an entire way of understanding naval warfare. The heavy cruiser as a concept was born from limitation, specifically from the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. That treaty, designed to prevent another naval arms race after the First World War, had placed strict limits on battleship construction. The great powers agreed to tonnage caps and building holidays, but the treaty had a gap. Cruisers under 10,000 tons with guns no larger than 8 inches were unrestricted in number. Naval architects immediately understood the opportunity. Japan, like the United States and Britain, began designing cruisers that would push right up to those treaty limits. The result was a new class of warship, the heavy cruiser, displacing approximately 10,000 tons, and armed with 8-inch guns in twin or triple turrets. These ships were meant to be the decisive striking force in fleet actions, capable of destroying lighter vessels and crippling enemy capital ships with concentrated gunfire. They were fast, usually capable of 33 to 35 knots, allowing them to close for gun action or withdraw from unfavorable engagements. They had armor sufficient to resist shells from other cruisers at typical combat ranges of 15 to 20,000 yards. The Imperial Japanese Navy embraced this new ship type with particular enthusiasm. Japanese naval doctrine, shaped by the victory at Tsushima, emphasized the decisive fleet engagement. In this philosophy, the battle would unfold in stages. First, Japanese submarines would attrite the approaching American fleet. Then, land-based aircraft and carrier aircraft would further weaken the enemy. Finally, when the ranges closed to 10 or 15,000 yards, Japanese battleships and cruisers would deliver the knockout blow through superior gunnery. The heavy cruiser fit perfectly into this doctrine as the fast striking force that would exploit any advantage and finish off damaged enemy ships. Japanese shipyards began producing heavy cruisers in the late 1920s. The Myoko class, completed between 1928 and 1929, displaced over 13,000 tons despite treaty limits, achieved through weight-saving measures that reduced armor protection in less critical areas. Each ship mounted 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, an unprecedented concentration of firepower for a cruiser. They could fire 260-pound shells, capable of penetrating 5 inches of armor at 15,000 yards. Their fire control systems, developed through years of testing and refinement, allowed accurate shooting at ranges beyond 20,000 yards in daylight conditions. The Mogami class followed in the mid-1930s, initially mounting 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets to comply with treaty restrictions. But Japanese designers had planned ahead. The turrets and barbettes were sized to accept 8-inch guns, and after treaty restrictions lapsed in 1937, the ships were rearmed with 10 8-inch guns, transforming them into heavy cruisers. This class incorporated the lessons learned from earlier designs, with improved armor distribution and better compartmentalization for damage control. By 1941, when Japan went to war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 18 heavy cruisers, the largest such force in the world. These ships had proven themselves in the opening months of the war. They had covered amphibious landings from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. They had shelled shore installations. They had escorted carrier task forces. And in several engagements, they had done exactly what they were designed to do, destroying enemy ships with gunfire. On February 27, 1942, in the Battle of the Java Sea, Japanese heavy cruisers demonstrated their capability against Allied forces. The cruisers Nachi and Haguro, supported by other vessels, engaged a combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian force in a running gun battle that lasted over 7 hours. The Allied force, hampered by communication problems and lack of coordination, lost 5 ships, including 2 cruisers. The Japanese suffered only minor damage. It was the kind of surface action Japanese doctrine had envisioned, and the heavy cruisers had performed exactly as designed. This success reinforced existing beliefs. The gun navy worked, heavy cruisers could decide battles. Superior gunnery, achieved through intensive training and excellent fire control equipment, could overcome numerical disadvantages. The crews of these ships, many of whom had participated in the Java Sea action, had absolute confidence in their vessels and their doctrine. They had sunk enemy cruisers with their 8-inch guns. They had proven the value of their intensive gunnery training. They believed, with the certainty born from actual combat success, that when the decisive battle came, their ships would deliver victory. The operation plan for Midway, designated MI in Japanese planning documents, was ambitious in scope and complex in execution. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had designed it to force a decisive engagement with what remained of American carrier forces after the Pearl Harbor attack. The plan involved multiple task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean, all timed to converge on Midway Island in early June of 1942. It was the Kantai-Kessen made manifest, the decisive battle that would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific and force the United States to negotiate a peace favorable to Japan. The heavy cruisers were integral to this plan, distributed across multiple force components. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, included the cruisers Tone and Chikuma. These ships served dual roles as reconnaissance platforms and as close escort for the carriers. Each carried 5 Type 0 reconnaissance float planes, long-range aircraft capable of searching hundreds of miles from the fleet. In the expected battle sequence, these float planes would locate American carriers, allowing the Japanese carriers to strike first. The cruisers themselves, with their 8-inch guns and 35-knot speed, would protect the carriers from any American surface ships that might attempt to close for a gun engagement. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo commanded the Midway Invasion Force Support Group, which included 4 more heavy cruisers, Haguro, Miyoko, Kumano, and Suzuya. This force would cover the actual amphibious landing on Midway, suppressing any remaining shore defenses after the carrier strikes and protecting the transports from enemy surface ships. The 2 battleships Kongo and Haruna accompanied this force, but the heavy cruisers were expected to be the primary striking arm, capable of rapid response to any threat. Admiral Takeo Kurita led another cruiser force built around Mogami and Mikuma, tasked with shelling Midway's installations in preparation for the invasion. These ships would approach at night, using their superior fire control equipment and well-trained gun crews to systematically destroy American positions on the island. The operation called for them to fire approximately 800 shells, a sustained bombardment that would leave the island's defenses shattered. The distribution of these 8 heavy cruisers across the operation reflected Japanese thinking about modern naval warfare. Carriers would deliver the initial strikes, but cruisers would provide the sustained firepower needed to destroy enemy surface forces and support the invasion. The guns, not the aircraft, would ultimately decide the battle. This was not ignorance of air power's importance. Japanese planners understood that carriers were powerful weapons, but in their doctrine, carriers were primarily offensive weapons used for striking first. The actual decisive engagement would occur when surface forces closed to gun range. This doctrine had historical validation. At Tsushima in 1905, Admiral Togo's battleships had destroyed the Russian fleet through superior gunnery. Every Japanese naval officer had studied this battle. The tactics, the positioning, the concentration of fire, all had become foundational principles. The carrier was simply a new weapon that extended the fleet's reach, allowing it to strike at longer ranges before the gun battle decided the outcome. The heavy cruiser, with its combination of firepower, speed, and protection, was still seen as the primary instrument for achieving decisive results. The crews of these 8 cruisers prepared for Midway with this understanding. They conducted gunnery drills, practicing the rapid, accurate fire that characterized Japanese naval excellence. They rehearsed damage control procedures, knowing that American return fire might damage their ships, but confident their training would keep them in action. They studied recognition silhouettes of American ships, preparing to identify targets quickly in the confusion of battle. They reviewed communication procedures, ensuring they could coordinate their fire effectively when the enemy fleet was located. On the cruiser Mogami, gunners cleaned and inspected their 8-inch guns with obsessive care. Each barrel could fire approximately 2 rounds per minute in sustained action, more in short bursts. The magazines held over 100 rounds per gun, a mix of armor-piercing shells for use against enemy cruisers and battleships, and high-explosive shells for lighter targets. Fire control, officers calibrated their optical rangefinders and mechanical computers, the precision instruments that would convert target bearing and range into firing solutions. Engine room crews ensured their machinery was operating at peak efficiency, ready to respond instantly to demands for changes in speed as the ship maneuvered for optimal firing position. Similar preparations occurred aboard all 8 heavy cruisers. These ships represented an enormous investment in resources, training, and doctrine. Japan had built them at considerable cost, diverting resources that might have gone to other programs. The Navy had spent years developing the tactics and training that would allow these ships to function as decisive instruments in fleet actions. The crews had internalized a doctrine that placed the gun at the center of naval warfare, supported by but not replaced by aircraft. Everything in their training, their experience, and their recent combat successes told them they were going into battle with the right tools and the right doctrine. They were wrong, but they had no way of knowing that yet. The 8 heavy cruisers converging on Midway in early June of 1942 represented not just ships, but entire communities of men who had dedicated their lives to mastering the art of naval gunnery. Aboard the cruiser Tone, the gun crews had trained together for years. The ship's 4 twin turrets, designated number 1 through number 4, each had their own crew hierarchies, their own traditions, their own informal competitions about which turret could achieve the fastest accurate fire. The turret captain for number 2 turret was a petty officer who had served in the gun crews since 1936. He had participated in gunnery competitions, where Tone had won fleet-wide recognition for accuracy. He knew the peculiarities of his guns, knew that the right barrel fired slightly left compared to the left barrel, a minor manufacturing variance that his gunners uncompensated for automatically. He knew the exact timing needed to load, aim, and fire, in the rhythm that produced maximum sustained accuracy. His crews could maintain 2 rounds per minute per gun for as long as the ammunition lasted, a rate achieved through countless drills and actual combat experience. The fire control officer aboard Tone was a lieutenant who had graduated from the Naval Academy at Tsushima in 1934. He had studied mathematics and physics, learned the complex calculations needed to hit a moving target from a moving platform at ranges exceeding 15 miles. The ship's main battery director, located high on the superstructure, gave him an elevated vantage point and housed the optical rangefinders and mechanical computers that transformed observations into firing solutions. In good visibility, he could acquire targets at 25,000 yards and begin generating accurate firing data at 20,000 yards. The system was excellent, among the best in any navy, refined through years of development and testing. Aboard the cruiser Mogami, the crew took particular pride in their ship's speed and firepower. Mogami could make 37 knots in ideal conditions, making it one of the fastest heavy cruisers afloat. This speed translated directly into tactical flexibility. The ship could close rapidly with inferior forces, could withdraw from superior ones, could position itself for optimal firing angles while denying the enemy the same advantage. The 10 8-inch guns mounted in 5 twin turrets gave Mogami a broadside weight of 2,600 pounds, enough to cripple any cruiser and seriously damage a battleship if hits were achieved on critical areas. The captain of Mogami, Akira Soji, was a veteran of the China campaigns and the opening months of the Pacific War. He had commanded his ship during the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, had participated in the Indian Ocean raid in April where Japanese carriers struck British bases in Ceylon. He understood combined operations, knew how to coordinate with carriers and battleships, had confidence in his crew's ability to execute complex maneuvers under fire. His ship represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval power, a symbol of the nation's ability to design and build world-class warships. The men serving aboard these 8 cruisers came from all across Japan. Some were from coastal towns where naval service was a tradition passed through generations. Others were from farming villages in the interior, young men who had joined the Navy, seeking adventure and opportunities not available in their home communities. They shared a common experience of rigorous training. Japanese naval training was deliberately harsh, designed to create men who could function under extreme stress and physical hardship. Recruits learned to endure cold, hunger, and exhaustion. They learned unquestioning obedience to orders and absolute dedication to their duties. This training philosophy extended to technical skills. Gunnery training involved thousands of practice rounds. countless hours learning to maintain and operate the complex mechanisms of naval guns. Fire control training required mastering mathematics, understanding the physics of ballistics, learning to use optical instruments with precision. Engineering training meant knowing every system aboard ship, being able to repair battle damage with improvised materials, maintaining machinery under combat conditions. The men aboard these 8 cruisers were not conscripts thrust into positions they barely understood. They were professionals who had spent years mastering their trades. The ships themselves reflected decades of engineering refinement. The 8-inch 50 caliber gun, the standard armament on all these cruisers, could fire its 260-pound shell at 2,700 feet per second. The armor-piercing projectile could penetrate 5 inches of face-hardened steel at 15,000 yards, enough to defeat the armor of any cruiser and damage battleships. The high-explosive shells carried over 8 pounds of explosive filler, sufficient to cause devastating damage to unarmored or lightly armored structures. Fire control systems could track multiple targets simultaneously, allowing the ships to shift fire rapidly as tactical situations changed. Protection came from armor belts 4 inches thick at the waterline, designed to keep out 6-inch shells at typical combat ranges. Turret faces had inch-thick armor. Deck armor ranged from 1 to 2 inches, providing protection against plunging fire at long ranges and bomb fragments from near misses. The ships had extensive compartmentalization, with watertight bulkheads dividing the hull into dozens of separate spaces. This design philosophy, learned from studying battle damage in the First World War, meant that flooding could be contained, fires could be isolated, and ships could survive significant damage while remaining operational. Yet for all this capability, for all the training and engineering excellence, for all the combat experience and doctrinal refinement, the 8 heavy cruisers steaming toward Midway carried a fatal assumption. They assumed the battle would unfold according to Doctrine, with carriers striking first and surface forces delivering the decisive blow. They assumed their guns would have targets within range. They assumed the enemy would play by the same rules, would understand that modern naval warfare still ultimately came down to ships maneuvering for position and pounding each other with gunfire until one side broke. None of these assumptions would prove correct. The morning of June 4th began with routine procedures aboard the cruiser Tone. At 0430 hours, the crew went to battle stations as the ship prepared to launch reconnaissance aircraft. The Type 0 float plane assigned to search Sector 4, the northeastern quadrant, where American forces might approach, sat on its catapult ready for launch. But there was a delay. A mechanical problem with the catapult, something wrong with the compressed air system, required repairs. The launch, scheduled for 0430, didn't occur until 0500 hours, a 30-minute delay that would have consequences far beyond a simple maintenance issue. By 0700 hours, Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier force was approaching the launch point for the first strike against Midway Island. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, began launching aircraft. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters lifted off and formed up. 108 aircraft total heading for Midway to suppress the American base there. The heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma maintained their positions in the formation, their crews watching the impressive display of carrier air power. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The first indication that something might be wrong came at 0705, when Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike and American aircraft began taking off to intercept. By 0710, land-based American aircraft from Midway were searching for the Japanese fleet. At 0753, a Japanese search plane, not from Tone but from the cruiser Chikuma, reported sighting American ships. The report was frustratingly vague. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Aboard Akagi, Nagumo's staff tried to determine what kind of ships had been sighted. Were they carriers or surface ships? The distinction mattered absolutely. If carriers, the Japanese would need to launch an immediate strike. If only cruisers and destroyers, they were not an immediate threat and could be dealt with after the second strike on Midway. At 0809, Nagumo ordered the search plane to ascertain ship types. The response didn't come for another 20 minutes, during which Japanese thinking remained focused on the planned operation, rather than on the possibility of an entirely different kind of battle. At 08:20, the Tones search aircraft, the one that had launched 30 minutes late due to mechanical problems, reported sighting 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 0 to 8 degrees, distance 200 miles from the Kido Butai. Still no confirmation of carriers. Japanese doctrine assumed that American carriers, if present, would be farther back, protected by surface forces. The search report seemed to confirm this assumption, but at 08:30, land-based American torpedo bombers from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers. The attack was uncoordinated and ineffective, with Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire shooting down most of the attackers without any hits being achieved. But the attack confirmed that American forces were aware of the Japanese fleet's position. Aboard the cruisers, Tone and Chikuma gun crews tracked the attacking aircraft but held fire as the combat air patrol handled the threat. The cruisers' primary role was protecting the carriers from surface attack, not air defense, though their lighter anti-aircraft guns could engage if targets came within range. The crews watched the one-sided slaughter of the American torpedo bombers with satisfaction. The air defenses were working exactly as designed. The Americans were being destroyed before they could threaten the carriers. At 08:35, the critical report finally came. The Tones search aircraft radioed, "Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." Finally, confirmation of the threat. But by this time, the Japanese carriers were in a vulnerable position. The aircraft that had struck Midway were returning and needed to land. The carriers had armed a second strike with bombs for use against Midway. But if American carriers were present, those bombs needed to be replaced with torpedoes for anti-ship attacks. The hangar decks became scenes of frantic activity as ordnance crews worked to rearm aircraft while simultaneously trying to recover the Midway strike force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American attack began at approximately 09:30 with another wave of torpedo bombers, this time from carriers rather than Midway. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet attacked without fighter escort and without coordination with other squadrons. The results were catastrophic for the Americans. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down all 15 aircraft. Not one torpedo hit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise suffered similar losses, with 10 of 14 aircraft destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12 aircraft. In less than an hour, American torpedo bomber squadrons had been virtually annihilated, without achieving a single hit on a Japanese carrier. Aboard the cruiser Tone, officers watched this slaughter with grim satisfaction. The Americans were brave, but their attacks were uncoordinated and suicidal. The combat air patrol was functioning perfectly. The carrier formation's defensive fire was devastatingly effective. Everything suggested that Japanese training, equipment, and tactics were superior. The heavy cruisers maintained their positions, ready to engage any American surface ships that might appear. But thus far, the battle was unfolding entirely in the air, and the Japanese were winning decisively. What the cruiser crews could not see, could not know from their positions several miles from the carriers, was that the suicidal American torpedo attacks had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. The fighters were engaged in chasing and destroying the torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude positions undefended. And at that precise moment, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, which had been searching for the Japanese fleet, arrived overhead at 14,000 feet. At approximately 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the entire character of the Pacific War changed in a span of approximately 6 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadrons, saw the Japanese carriers below him. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were visible, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. McCluskey split his force, directing one squadron at Kaga while he led the other against Akagi. Almost simultaneously, dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, found Soryu. The attacks began at 10:22. The first bombs struck Akagi within seconds, hitting amidships near the midship elevator. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and torpedoes that had been removed from aircraft during the rearming process and were sitting exposed on the hangar deck. Secondary explosions followed immediately as fires spread to other aircraft and ammunition. Within minutes, Akagi was burning out of control, her firefighting systems damaged by the initial hits, her crew unable to contain the spreading fires. Aboard the heavy cruiser Tone, the first indication of catastrophe came not from visual observation, but from radio communications. Emergency calls from the carriers filled the airwaves, terse reports of bomb hits and fires. Officers on Tone's bridge turned their binoculars toward the carrier formation several miles away. What they saw was impossible to reconcile with their training, their doctrine, their entire understanding of how naval battles were supposed to unfold. Massive columns of black smoke rose from at least 3 carriers, not the grey-white smoke of gun actions or minor fires, but the dark, roiling smoke of aviation fuel fires, of catastrophic damage, of ships dying. Captain Takama's first instinct was to bring his ship to the carrier's aid, to position Tone where its anti-aircraft guns could provide additional defense. But the bombs had already fallen. The American dive bombers were withdrawing, their mission accomplished. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were all burning, all clearly out of action. Within minutes, reports came through that Akagi had ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. Kaga was listing and dead in the water. Soryu was racked by internal explosions as fires reached magazine spaces. The gun crews aboard Tone stood at their battle stations, hands on controls for weapons that had no targets within range. The 8-inch guns, capable of destroying enemy ships at 18 miles, were useless against aircraft. The smaller anti-aircraft guns could engage planes, but only if those planes came within a few miles of the ship. The American dive bombers had struck from 14,000 feet, well above the effective range of the cruiser's light anti-aircraft weapons, and had withdrawn before the cruisers could maneuver into supporting positions. The most powerful surface combatants in the Japanese fleet had been spectators to their own defeat. Aboard the cruiser Mogami, over 100 miles to the south with Vice Admiral Kondo's Invasion Force Support Group, the news arrived by radio. 3 carriers hit and burning, possibly sinking. The shock was visceral and immediate. Captain Soji read the reports, trying to understand how this could have happened. The carriers had been protected by combat air patrol. The American attacks had been driven off with massive losses. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated. How had dive bombers gotten through to deliver what appeared to be fatal blows to 3 fleet carriers simultaneously? The answer, though Soji could not have fully understood it at the time, lay in the fundamental mathematics of air defense in 1942. Japanese fighters could not be everywhere at once. The suicidal American torpedo attacks had drawn the combat air patrol down to wave-top level, leaving high-altitude approaches undefended. The dive bombers had approached from angles not covered by the ship's anti-aircraft fire due to the carrier's need to maneuver into the wind to recover their own aircraft. The coordination between different American squadrons, while accidental rather than planned, had created a window of vulnerability that lasted perhaps 10 minutes. That had been enough, but understanding the tactical details didn't change the strategic reality. The 4 carriers of the Kido Butai had been the primary striking force of the Japanese fleet. Everything else, the battleships, the cruisers, the destroyers, all existed to support and protect those carriers. Now 3 of them were burning, and the 4th, Hiryu, was alone, trying to launch counterstrikes against the American carriers, with the reduced aircraft complement remaining after the morning's losses. The heavy cruisers, for all their guns and armour and speed, could do nothing to change this situation. Their weapons could not reach the American carriers. Their armour could not protect the Japanese carriers from aerial attack. Their speed was irrelevant when the battle was being fought by aircraft operating at ranges of over 100 miles. On the bridge of the cruiser Chikuma, Officers watched as Akagi, the flagship of the Kido Butai, was abandoned. Vice Admiral Nagumo and his staff transferred to the light cruiser Nagara, the site of Japan's premier carrier, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, being evacuated while fires consumed it, was psychologically devastating. These were men who had believed absolutely in the superiority of Japanese naval forces. They had won every engagement in the war thus far. They had destroyed the American battleship line at Pearl Harbor. They had sunk British capital ships in the Indian Ocean. And now, in the span of minutes, they had lost 3 fleet carriers to an enemy they had believed was broken and demoralized. The cruiser Tone received orders to screen the damaged carriers to protect them from any possible surface attack while damage control efforts continued. But there would be no damage control that could save these ships. By mid-afternoon, Kaga sank, going down by the bow as flooding overwhelmed her compartments. Soryu sank in the early evening, her back broken by internal explosions. Akagi, though kept afloat for several hours by her surviving crew's damage control efforts, was so thoroughly wrecked that she had to be scuttled by Japanese destroyers the next morning. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch strikes against the American carrier Yorktown, inflicting damage that would eventually lead to Yorktown's loss. But American dive bombers found Hiryu in the late afternoon and bombed her into a burning wreck. She would sink early on June 5th. The 8 heavy cruisers that had come to Midway ready to deliver decisive gunfire had not fired a single 8-inch shell at an enemy ship. The battle they had trained for, the engagement their entire doctrine was built around, had not occurred. Instead, they had watched as carrier aircraft, operating at ranges beyond any gun's reach, had decided the battle. The cruiser crews performed their assigned duties with professional competence. They screened the damaged carriers. They recovered survivors from the water. They maintained formation and prepared for possible night actions. But they could not change the fundamental reality that their primary weapons had been irrelevant to the battle's outcome. Aboard the cruiser Mogami, word came through on June 5th that the operation was being cancelled. The invasion force would withdraw. Without air cover from carriers, without control of the airspace around Midway, continuing the operation would be suicidal. The heavy cruisers, still at full combat capability, with their guns unfired and their crews ready, turned away from the enemy and began the long voyage back to Japan. As they withdrew, Mogami and her sister ship Mikuma collided during nighttime maneuvering, leaving both ships damaged. American aircraft found them the next day and attacked. Mikuma, unable to maneuver effectively due to collision damage, was bombed repeatedly and eventually sank. Mogami survived but required extensive repairs, arriving back in Japan with her bow crushed and her forward turrets damaged, casualties of a nighttime collision rather than enemy gunfire. The heavy cruisers that survived Midway returned to Japan in mid-June of 1942, carrying crews who had witnessed something that contradicted everything they had been taught about naval warfare. Tone and Chikuma arrived at Hashirajima anchorage on June 13th, their crews exhausted not from combat but from the psychological strain of watching their fleet's primary striking force destroyed while they stood by helpless. The ships themselves were undamaged. Their magazines were full of ammunition that had never been fired. Their engines had operated flawlessly throughout the operation. Yet they returned in defeat, having contributed nothing to a battle that had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and over 3,000 men. Captain Takama of Tone filed his action report with meticulous attention to detail, documenting the timeline of events, the search aircraft delays, the positioning of his ship throughout the engagement. But the report could not capture the bewilderment his crew felt. Experienced petty officers who had served in the gun crews for years, who had trained endlessly for the decisive surface engagement, tried to understand what had gone wrong. The carriers had been hit by bombs. That much was clear. But carriers were supposed to be protected by their own aircraft and by the screening ships around them. How had American bombers penetrated those defenses so completely? The answer, though it would take months of analysis to fully understand, lay in the fundamental vulnerability of aircraft carriers in 1942. A carrier was a floating airfield, its deck crowded with aircraft, its hangar spaces filled with aviation fuel and ordnance. Unlike a battleship or cruiser, which carried its weapons in armoured turrets and magazines deep within the hull, a carrier kept its offensive power on or near the deck, where it could be launched quickly. This design, optimized for offensive striking power, created catastrophic vulnerability when the enemy got through the defences. A single bomb hit in the wrong place, detonating among fueled and armed aircraft, could set off a chain reaction that no amount of damage control could contain. The Imperial Japanese Navy had understood this vulnerability in theory, but theory had not prepared them for the reality of 3 carriers burning simultaneously, of fires so intense that firefighting equipment melted before it could be used, of secondary explosions blowing holes in flight decks and destroying pumping systems. The heavy cruisers, designed to protect carriers from surface threats, had been unable to protect them from the one threat that mattered: aerial attack from beyond visual range. The gun navy, despite all its training and capability, had been rendered obsolete by a form of warfare it was not equipped to counter. Vice Admiral Kondo's cruiser force, which had been positioned over 100 miles south of the Kido-Butai, returned to Japan without having seen the enemy at all. The 4 heavy cruisers, Haguro, Miyoko, Kumano, and Suzuya, had been ready to engage American surface forces in the night action that Japanese doctrine expected would follow the carrier exchanges. That night action never came. Instead, orders arrived to withdraw, to avoid further contact with an enemy that had proven it could project lethal force through carrier aircraft while remaining beyond the reach of Japanese guns. The crews of these ships experienced perhaps the purest distillation of the lesson Midway taught. Readiness and capability meant nothing if the battle was fought in a domain where your weapons could not reach. Admiral Yamamoto, who had commanded the overall operation from the battleship Yamato over 300 miles behind the carrier force, bore ultimate responsibility for the defeat. He had designed a plan that dispersed Japanese forces across thousands of miles of ocean, preventing them from supporting each other when the critical moment came. He had assumed American carriers, if present, would react to the Midway attack rather than striking preemptively. He had underestimated American intelligence capabilities and the determination of American commanders to take risks for potential decisive results. Most fundamentally, he had planned for a carrier exchange followed by a surface action, not understanding that the carrier exchange alone could be decisive. The post-battle analysis conducted by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo struggled with uncomfortable questions. How could 4 fleet carriers be sunk in a single day? How could American forces, supposedly demoralized and weakened after 6 months of continuous defeats, have achieved such a complete victory? The analysis focused on tactical details, on the search plane delays from tone, on the decision to rearm the second strike with torpedoes, on the failure of the combat air patrol to maintain altitude discipline. These were all legitimate factors, but they obscured the larger truth that Japanese naval doctrine, built around the concept of the decisive gun battle, was fundamentally inadequate for carrier warfare. The heavy cruiser force, that symbol of treaty-era naval thinking and the gun navy's power, had been present at Midway in strength. 8 ships mounting 64 8-inch guns had been ready to engage. They had accomplished nothing because the battle had been decided by aircraft operating at ranges where guns were irrelevant. This lesson should have been obvious. The loss of the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse to Japanese air attack 6 months earlier had demonstrated that even capital ships were vulnerable to sustained aerial attack, but Japan's own success in that engagement had reinforced the belief that carriers were primarily offensive weapons, useful for striking first but not for sustained fleet actions. Midway shattered that belief for anyone paying attention. The battle had been won and lost entirely through carrier aviation. The side with effective carrier forces operating under competent command had destroyed the enemy's carriers before surface forces could engage. The heavy cruisers, battleships, and destroyers that constituted the bulk of both fleets' tonnage had been spectators. Their crews had trained for years to fight a battle that never happened, and, after Midway, would never happen in the Pacific War. The 4 carriers lost at Midway represented not just ships, but an irreplaceable portion of Japan's trained carrier aircrew. Approximately 248 aircraft went down with the carriers or were lost in combat operations that day. More critically, over 100 trained pilots and aircrew were killed. These were men who had trained for years, who had combat experience from China and the opening months of the Pacific War, who represented the core of Japan's carrier aviation capability. They could not be quickly replaced. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained by years of war in China and 6 months of operations across the Pacific, could not regenerate carrier forces at the rate needed to maintain parity with the United States. The Shokaku-class carriers under construction would not be ready until 1944. Converting merchant ships and auxiliary vessels to light carriers would provide some replacement capability, but these conversions resulted in ships inferior, in almost every respect, to purpose-built fleet carriers. More fundamentally, Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure to train replacement pilots at the rate losses demanded. The United States, by contrast, was ramping up production at unprecedented rates. The Essex-class carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons and capable of operating 90 to 100 aircraft, were being built at multiple shipyards. The first, USS Essex, would commission in December of 1942. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-class carriers would be in service. By the end of 1944, 11 more would join the fleet. The Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, would add another 9 ships by the end of 1943. American naval aviation training schools were producing thousands of pilots annually, far more than losses could deplete. This transformation had been gradual but accelerating. Aircraft had been used for reconnaissance and spotting in the First World War. By the 1920s, carriers were being built and aviation doctrine was being developed. The 1930s saw steady improvements in aircraft performance, with bombers becoming faster, more reliable, and capable of carrying heavier bomb loads. But doctrine lagged behind technology. Naval establishments in all nations, trained and promoted based on their understanding of gun-based warfare, struggled to fully comprehend the implications of carrier aviation. Even advocates of air power often saw carriers as adjuncts to the battle fleet rather than as the primary striking force. Midway forced this recognition in the most brutal way possible. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had been at the forefront of carrier aviation development and had used carriers with devastating effectiveness at Pearl Harbor and throughout the opening months of the war, lost its premier carrier force in a single day. The lesson was unmistakable. In modern naval warfare, the side with superior carrier aviation would win. Everything else was secondary. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers all existed primarily to protect carriers, and would never again be the decisive elements in fleet actions between major powers. For the men who served aboard the heavy cruisers at Midway, this lesson was personal and painful. They had spent years mastering skills that turned out to be largely irrelevant to the war they were actually fighting. The gunnery training, the endless drills, the mathematical calculations for firing solutions, all of it had prepared them for battles that would rarely occur. When surface actions did happen, particularly the night battles around Guadalcanal in the latter half of 1942, Japanese cruisers often performed well, their superior night-fighting doctrine and excellent optics giving them advantages over American forces still learning to fight at night. But these were tactical successes that did not change the strategic reality that carrier aviation was deciding the Lumend war's outcome. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. These were professional naval officers and sailors who had dedicated their lives to their service. They took pride in their skills, in their ships, in their navy's traditions and capabilities. To discover that their primary weapons were obsolete, that their training had been for a kind of warfare that no longer determined strategic outcomes, was devastating. Some adapted, shifting their understanding to accept the new reality. Others struggled, clinging to the belief that there would still be a decisive gun battle, that their training and capabilities would eventually be vindicated. That validation never came. The broader lesson of Midway extends beyond naval doctrine to fundamental questions about military preparedness and institutional learning. Organizations, particularly military organizations with strong traditions and established doctrines, struggle to adapt when the nature of warfare changes. Fundamentally, the investment in existing capabilities, both material and intellectual, creates resistance to accepting that those capabilities have become obsolete. The Japanese Navy had spent decades and enormous resources developing the world's finest heavy cruiser force. Accepting that those cruisers were no longer the decisive arm of naval power meant accepting that those investments had been, if not wasted, at least superseded by developments the Navy had failed to adequately prioritize. This pattern repeated across all combatants in World War II. The French Army, which had developed the world's best doctrine and equipment for fighting the First World War, was defeated in 6 weeks in 1940 by German forces that had learned to integrate tanks and aircraft in mobile warfare. The German Navy, which had developed excellent submarine technology and doctrine, was eventually defeated by Allied developments in radar, sonar, and code breaking that made submarine operations increasingly untenable. The British Royal Air Force, which had believed strategic bombing would be decisive, discovered that even thousands of heavy bombers could not win the war without ground forces to exploit the destruction. In each case, organizations invested heavily in capabilities that proved less decisive than anticipated, while their opponents developed countermeasures or entirely different approaches. The 8 heavy cruisers at Midway stand as monuments to this phenomenon. They were excellent ships, well designed for their intended purpose, crewed by skilled professionals, maintained to high standards. They failed not because of any deficiency in their construction or operation, but because the war they were designed to fight was not the war that actually occurred. Their guns never fired at enemy ships during the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War, because that battle was fought entirely by aircraft. The crews could only watch as their carriers burned, unable to help, their weapons useless against enemies they could not reach. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson military history teaches. Preparation matters, training matters, equipment quality matters, but all of these can be rendered irrelevant if the nature of warfare changes in ways that institutional doctrine fails to anticipate. The Japanese Navy at Midway was not poorly led or inadequately equipped. It was fighting according to a doctrine that had become obsolete, unable to adapt quickly enough when confronted with evidence that the fundamental nature of naval warfare had changed. The heavy cruisers, symbols of that obsolete doctrine, would continue to serve throughout the war, but never in the role they had been designed for, never firing their guns in the decisive engagement their designers and crews had envisioned. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.